because I'm a masochist, and because sometimes I feel as a blogger, you really should when something's going on like that. And I also, I just find the smear campaign against the Center for American Progress, which is really an attempt to coerce it into changing its position on American foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel, to be unsettling. I just don't like that impulse to smear and ostracize and police debate. On the other hand, of course, this term is exactly trying to police the debate in the opposite direction, which is why I haven't used the term and don't like the term and wouldn't use the term. But I do think that it's worth pointing out that some supporters of Israel are so passionate about their position and so defensive for all sorts of reasons that I think are actually understandable. Although there's also a generational difference here. The younger generation is by and large much less sort of defensive, paranoid, insecure, and knee-jerky about it. I do think there comes a point at which that passion leads to a view that there can never be any distinction between American interests and Israeli interests. In the words of Mitt Romney, there should never be an inch of difference between the United States and Israel. Well, I think there is an inch. There's thousands of miles, actually. And I think with the global war on terror and the question of emerging Arab democracies and the desperate need for regime change in Iran, there are obviously going to be real differences between both the priorities of the United States and Israel and the timing and pacing of certain policies with respect to the Arab Spring and indeed Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. And I think that passion means they cannot see that that could be a problem. And that those of us who actually begin to think that Israel is becoming a liability for the United States, an albatross, as it were, and could damage the United States' long-term interests in the Middle East quite badly. And when there is an obvious way forward, and they refuse to take it, and when the Israeli government is clearly orchestrating and in close contact with a whole bunch of people, a range of people in the United States to make their case, which is perfectly legitimate and legal. Nonetheless, I think the whole thing can get obscured. And when then someone calls them on that and says, look, this is too uncritical, this is too one-sided, this isn't in perspective, to then accuse them instantly of being anti-Semites or Israel haters or having disdain or disgust for Israel. I don't see that in Glenn Greenwald's writing. I see his concern that the United States is funding, directly funding, an occupation which is insupportable, in my view, and in his view, and also funding some rather nasty violations of international law, like assassinating civilian scientists in other countries, stealing the passports and identities of your alleged allies, telling the United States that Israel will strike Iran without even giving America any warning if that's what the Netanyahu government decides. That's worth worrying about. It's worth criticizing. It's worth standing up for. So I think, frankly, it'd be better if we cut out the anti-Semite charges and the Israel Firster charges and talked about the substance. But I do think there is substance there, and I do think that when someone like Sheldon Adelson, who has such a huge influence in Republican politics, says that it was unfortunate that he wore an American uniform rather than Israeli uniform when he was younger, and that his children will wear Israeli uniforms, then I think we have a level of passion and devotion to the cause of Israel that is really obscuring any other calculation and interest involved in the United States. And I think that's not a balanced view. And that, since his influence, Gingrich has moved to opposing a two-state solution from favoring it. And that, in fact, the Republican Party is moving slowly, with the help of its end times evangelicals, towards a greater Israel policy as such, which would isolate the United States terribly internationally. I think it matters. And I think it's necessary to point this out. Of course, this wouldn't have happened without Citizens United, but that's another problem. But yeah, that worries me, and I think it's worth noting. And I think people who wield huge power and blanket airwaves in Florida and South Carolina with ads have and declare their fundamental objective to be the permanent occupation of the West Bank, and have actually told and discussed with Gingrich the fact that the Palestinian people do not exist. Then I think we have a problem. And I don't think Glenn Greenwald deserves being called a hater of Israel for pointing it out. But I also don't think that passionate Americans who really believe that it's in America's interests that no pressure ever be put on an Israeli government, and that an Israeli government de facto, unlike any other, should be able to do whatever it wants and have complete, total American support at all times. That is not a foreign policy. That is a domestic policy. That's not America dealing with Israel. That's a fusion of the two, which is constitutionally not right, and I think confuses the core elements of America's foreign policy. We have to look. I'm a recovering neocon. I do think interests matter. And I do think, even not as a recovering neocon, the democracies in the emerging Arab world will be pro-American or anti-American, very largely depending upon how we handle the occupation in Palestine. And I worry that by strapping the United States to the mast of Greater Israel, to Netanyahu's belligerent and disgusting attack on the president for supporting a policy along the 1967 lines, which has been essentially the policy for the last God knows how many years, was wrong. So that's where I end up. But I also just think more discourse on this is better if we can avoid the insults. And it's been too frozen for too long by fear and intimidation. And anybody that wades into that fight, I've got his or her back.